Welcome, everybody, to our discussion of governance metrics. What was our title again?
Something
Government
with a lot of
methods.
M's in it.
Yeah, measurement methods matter. This is something that, I think is near and dear to all of us on the call because we've all had more or less beaten into our heads that if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So we're going to talk about, and hopefully you guys are going to share your thoughts about, you know, what are we supposed to be doing here? What are we supposed to be measuring? How are we supposed to be measuring it? Maybe some things that we're not supposed to measure for reasons that we'll get into shortly. We want to start out with an introduction, and because we're all shy, shrinking violet types, introductions tend to go for about 20 minutes. So instead, I would like to suggest that everybody introduce yourselves all at once.
Once.
I will tell you the cue, and then you tell us just who you're from and who you work for. All right. One, two, three. Hi, I'm Jesse
I'm
Wilkins, and
I'm
Steve
I work.
Janet.
Donda
Weissman.
I'm
Young,
from
Young
Oh,
China
great.
Consulting.
The
Consultants,
info
and
cup
I am
guy.
the
Legislative
director of
Assembly
records.
Saskatchewan.
I cannot wait to see what the AI recording does for that.
That's awesome.
All
Uh,
right. So, kind of the idea here is that we have stories that we can share about metrics and how metrics can go terribly, terribly wrong. But really, what we're hoping for, as the title of this series suggests, is that this will be a conversation. So, as we cover different perspectives and angles, we'd love to hear your take on the good, the bad, and the truly horrifically ugly as we go. If you're a shy, shrinking violet type, at some point, we're probably going to pick on you and say, Janet, what do you think about whatever we're talking about in that moment? It's not because we don't like you, it's because we know that all of us together are smarter than any one or two of us put together. And we know you've seen a thing or two and know a thing or two as a result. So,
yes, we do like to make this a very round table kind of event, not just three talking heads.
So how
now,
come
by
I'm
the
sitting
way,
here at the corner if it's a
if
round
if
table?
if you do want, we would encourage you to put your name, company, and location separately in the chat so that other people can actually sift through the cacophony we just created and get to know who you are. And I will do that shortly as soon as I ask our first question. So I just got done saying you can't improve what you don't measure. We can't manage what we don't measure. So we want to start out by talking about maybe what to measure. What are the characteristics of a good metric? And maybe contrariwise, what are the characteristics of a not so good metric? Um, Donda, why don't you start us off?
Sorry, I was typing. Can you go to somebody else?
Steve, why don't you continue us off?
Characteristics of something good to measure? I was thinking about typing.
Nice try.
Metrics. Okay. I was going to say metrics need to be measurable, and I know that sounds silly.
A little
Um,
tautological, but
well, yes, a bit. Um, uh, they have to be meaningful. I mean, I'm of the school that you can measure pretty much anything, even if you have to be creative about it. Um, but they have to be relevant and they have to be repeatable. It's almost like running a scientific experiment. You can do it and you do it once and that's cool, and maybe you publish a report on it, maybe you don't, but you got to be able to do it again and do it the same way. So, like in science, you're hoping to get the same result because then maybe you're really onto some new theory. When it comes to governance, you want to do it the same way so you can tell really if you're making any progress or not. And if you're not, maybe there are changes and maybe you like some of those changes. It was an unanticipated outcome. But whatever you pick, it needs to be well enough defined that you can do it again and be able to compare and glean something from it. It's not measurement for its own sake. So it was weird, but that's kind of what I meant by you have to measure measurable things
Yeah,
instead
and
of
I
just
think it
making it up.
has to be timely within, trying to do it, whatever it is that you're measuring. There could be some very specific measurements that need to be done within a certain time-bound restraint. And I think understanding what those restraints are important because you may have to bubble those up maybe a little more urgently than some of the other things that you're measuring. I've felt that pain before. Sometimes your bosses want you to have certain metrics in a certain given period. Hey, give us all the things. But then when we're talking, oh, I don't know, budget time, some of those metrics might be needed a little more urgently. So I would say make sure that you're aware of any time-bound restraints that you have to be under when you're doing your measurements.
John, you had posted in the chat, metrics help me get to my desired future state. You want to expand on
Yeah,
that?
so I've been here about 14 months now. And so first you just want to get a lay of a hold of the land, try to identify the current state. So where's your organization right now in terms of information management? Then you see the gaps. You're like, well, what's the future state look like? And that's where, belonging to organizations helps. And, having some experience, you kind of identify that panacea of where you want to go. And then it starts the long process of getting to that desired future state, which, by the way, I want to make sure it aligns with my organization's strategy as well. I just don't want to have this standoff ID strategy that doesn't support the business. So the metrics here for like the cover sheet I just put in, and Donda will appreciate this, we're implementing a series of we call them RIM reps, RIM representatives, and throughout the entire organization. So we have 30,000 people in our company. So we're not going to have that many RIM reps, but we're going to have quite a bit. And so how am I measuring that? Well, every person we get as a RIM representative, obviously they're being tracked. And so we're going to build that to see how many groups are going to have RIM reps. And so that'll be a major metric in 2025. So let's say by the end of the year, we get 30% of the organization that actually have RIM reps. That's a meaningful metric that I could, share up the leadership pipeline. So one example.
Yep.
Okay.
Yay, John. Super
Yeah,
happy about that.
and I think that's the kind of measurement too, at least with a goodly percentage of the clients that I work with. The simple fact that you are using as a metric the number of RIM reps you have is important. Because I think otherwise the assumption is, well, every group's gonna have one, therefore. It's like, yeah, okay, but did you realize that as a matter of practical fact, or are you just assuming? So, I thought it was worth taking a second. Just it can and should be that fundamental. So again, to quote Donda Young, "Yay, John."
You don't want to assume, do you?
No,
No.
and it happens a lot.
Right. Well, I mean, we see a lot of issues, for example, with software uptake, right? You have 30,000 employees, you bought 30,000 seats. First, did you need that many seats? But second, how many people are actually using the software in the way it was intended and improving business outcomes? And that's probably 2 or 3 separate metrics within there. Similarly, I see an awful lot of training programs, often for managers, but for line staff as well, where completion is assumed to mean somebody learned, right? You have to do your workplace harassment, you have to do your conflict resolution, you have to do, introduction to
Cyber.
COVID, whatever. And you have to do this every year. And we get our retention stuff into the annual training and we're like, woohoo! And sometimes people even do it, or at least they check the box that says they completed it for that year. But were they watching it? Was it playing in the background? Did they speed it up to 2x while they're Netflixing or something? We don't know. So it's one thing to identify things that are measurable and measurable in a way that's relevant. I'm thinking about that whole SMART goals thing, right? Um, and now it just left my pretty little head. Specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. And I think a lot of metrics align with that too.
Deborah,
Anybody?
you have your hand up.
Yes, Deborah, go ahead. Sorry.
So I think what we're all saying here is we're not measuring the activity so much as the results. So what you're saying, yes, you can measure people took the class. However, the result is not in on their performance and what they attained and retained from that training. That's the result, right? That everybody has taken the training, understands the training, and are practicing what they have been taught in that training. That's the result. That's what's measurable and meaningful.
That's what's meaningful. I 100% agree with
Yes.
that. That's a really interesting point, Deborah, because taking the training is certainly measurable, but what's the point of it, right? And what's the outcome? And did we achieve that expected change in behavior, expected outcome, whatever? And John just posted in the chat, um, we had X% less safety accidents. That's a great one, and that's outcome based. It doesn't tell us anything about the training, but it says that there was we're making an assumption and a connection that better and more safety training led to fewer safety accidents, right? Yes, Chris, training could be a whole other meaning. Compliance with what?
But
So
I think it's an important distinction though too, because with my research hat on, it it would be nice to know for sure, is it a result of training? Was there a corresponding reduction in the number of accidents because there was an increase in the training? Or was it some other factor, like the bosses were on site that month or
Or are there less
something?
people,
Right,
less people involved, and that brought down the percentage of accidents
right,
because maybe there was a reduction in staff.
right. So it's the correlation causality thing.
yes,
Or they, yeah, like exactly, Steve. So I hate to say this, but somebody got hurt and they all witnessed it. Oh, we shouldn't do that. Oh,
Yeah,
there's
right.
a lesson learned right there. I mean,
That's what siblings are for.
well, that's true.
Lewis
yeah,
is
I
being
don't.
polite.
Well,
Lewis,
yeah,
please.
actually, not just polite. For some reason, the raise hand command has disappeared completely from
Oh,
every
Oh,
menu on my Zoom thing.
no.
You don't
It's
raise
time
your
to
hand with this
react.
group.
I want to point out, I think we have a history, though, in information management of giving performance metrics that somehow don't make information management better. And an example would be we've disposed of twice as many boxes this year as we did last year. That isn't necessarily better or worse.
Mm.
And I think we have a lot of those. And I can see why business has trouble with that.
Now,
well, the context is, yeah, go ahead,
I
Jesse.
could have
Sorry.
destroyed 2 boxes this year and one last year.
That's
well,
right.
where I was going with that is I had a project last year, and I'm just about to start another project this year that involved boxes, and so it's kind of near and dear to my heart. In the case last year, the boxes were on offsite storage, but it was in their warehouse, so there wasn't really a cost for it other than, oh, I need stuff from that box. Somebody's got to put it in the back of their car and drive it to whoever is requesting it. Um, and so in that case, saying that we're getting rid of boxes, who cares in the grand scheme of things, right? But the one I'm trying to land right now, they're spending $500,000 a year in offsite storage with a third-party storage service. And they believe that by getting rid of some of those boxes, they're going to reduce their spend. It's an accounting firm. The partners, the managing partners, are all profit sharing. And so it's literally money out of their pockets to pay for this offsite storage. And so they made the case to let out this consulting gig on the idea that it may cost them $50,000 in consulting, but if they can save half of $500,000 a year, that's real money.
Yeah.
No, for
And so
sure.
they're very interested in getting rid of
and
boxes.
and there the goal is financial savings.
Yes.
If I were to translate that into the electronic world, you don't get the same financial savings
Right.
by doubling the amount of disposition. So that probably would have been a better example if I chose.
No, and that's fair, but they're looking at that as well. In their case, more so from a privacy perspective because they're based in California and they have to deal with CCPA. So it's a different reason, and the metric of getting rid of stuff, you're right. It's not going to be a financial one. I'm not even sure you could make the argument that it would be an operational one. So it's a little less tangible, and those are always difficult, right?
Well, it's compliance. It's a compliant one, right?
Yeah, I think so, but again, for an accounting firm, it's real hard to connect those dots, and that's
Okay.
one of the things they're struggling with.
Well, here's the kicker to that. What about their data storage? How much are they spending in electronic data storage? If you throw that into the mix and delete the data that you're destroying the boxes from,
Right.
if they're matching, then there's double the savings, right? So if they're making it a financial, then maybe you can.
Yeah. Cindy, you have your hand up.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes, and please drive safely.
Thank you, sir. I will. What I was going to say is in my time in financial services, my metrics had to be both quantitative in numbers and percentages. And what I mean by that is for numbers, I was responsible for pulling the electronic evidence for Deloitte, and we had that having the number of requests and the type of requests made of us was showing how many resources were in use, the resource trends, and they could equate that to the time and dollars spent on those particular litigation courses. But then we also did do some metrics in percentages for compliance to show the people that were sent these requests, were these requests responded to on time and were they logged into the system accurately? Because that goes back to the training. We did do training, and yes, people check off the box, and the more you use the system and are part of the process, the better you'll be. So it was better for us to say, similar to the box example, you might have 30 requests this month, you might have two, but if you can see the percentage of accuracy, that resonated a lot better than just having a number itself. So again, in financial services, we had to do kind of certain things were numbers and certain were percentages, whatever showed the better story for the leaders.
Well, you
I'll
just used,
go ahead,
sorry,
Steve.
you guys know me, I get excited, so you have to kick me. But Cindy, you just used the word I was thinking. It is about the story. And I think that, and we've hit around it in a couple of the comments just now, when do you use raw data and when do you use the percentages? Typical consultant answer, it depends, but you want to frame the story as accurately as possible. So, John, like you said, if I got rid of one box this year and two this, next year, it's a huge percentage, but you haven't really done anything.
Right.
And those that you're needing to get approval or dollars from will take advantage of that kind of thin logic if they're given the opportunity. I think it's important to present both, or at least address both, in order to make that case, and also that context. So, John, you had mentioned it earlier. In theater terms, we almost would have called it an aside, but yes, it has to, all this has to be tied to what the organizational objective is. It's my old bumper sticker, what business problem you're trying to solve. If you're trying to get rid of just raw boxes, that's one thing. If you're trying to protect yourself against privacy compliance violations, that's another thing. And it's important to be clear about which thing or things you're addressing to make sure that it all aligns and you're measuring things that are relevant to those objectives. So everything that we've talked about, they're all connected, which I think is another reason it's such a challenge, because it's
Oh,
hard to pick one and say, do this.
right. I want to pick up on what you just said, Steve, and tie it to what Cindy just said in the idea of you have a number and you have percentages, and there's a third axis here, which is over time, right?
Mm.
And so on the one hand, one box last year, two boxes this year, that example from John. But if you can track the fact that your number of boxes has been decreasing by an average of 5% every year for the last 2 years, and then figure out what story that's telling, I think that can be powerful. If you know that you can tie increased amount of training delivered and quantify that in some way that say accidents have decreased every month since we implemented that training, that trending, I think, is in many respects more valuable than whatever the raw number is for a given time period. But now I want to come back to what you just said about telling the story. And I think one of the challenges that we sometimes run into, especially us as consultants, is that observation changes reality, right? And I know some of us are old school enough to have gone into a company with a briefcase and a jacket or a suit. Uh, Ignore me, ignore the man behind the curtain, and I'm just going to observe you. I'm going to watch what you do during your day. And first of all, people panic thinking you're trying to get them fired, a la Office Space. But even then, observation changes reality. And there's a great scene in, one of the most powerful movies ever, Schindler's List, where the little Jewish guy is making hinges, I believe it is. And one of the Nazis asks him to show him how long it takes to make a hinge, and he does it in, I don't know, 20, 30 seconds. And he looks at the bucket full of hinges, but there's only 3 or 4 hinges in it. The Nazi doesn't care why the bucket is not filled. He doesn't care about the reason why 30 seconds didn't lead to a whole bucket being filled with hinges. He just knows that the bucket's not filled, and so clearly the guy was malingering, and he pulls out his pistol to execute him on the spot, and thankfully the pistol doesn't fire. It's jammed or something. And so they wander off and the guy's life is saved. But I always think of that when I think of these metrics discussions, because we don't know why the guy only made 4 hinges. There could be a lot of reasons for it, but we do know that people right now are attending webinars like this, or they're watching the basketball tournament, or they're watching the Final Four when that happened during work. And so when I show up with my clipboard and briefcase, none of that's happening. All of a sudden, productivity goes way up. There's almost an argument that every company should have consultants barreling into their offices on a regular basis, because they'd stop all of the surfing on the web and would be focused on their jobs.
Yeah. And then all I can think of is, Schrodinger's data, That's a really
John?
good point, though. And it's a different take on your comment about looking at things over time. Because even if there are bosses or consultants on site, like, certainly many of the projects here, they're measurable months in lengths. And the newness of the overseer or the measurer, in these cases, a lot of times me, fades, and people then revert to their usual modus operandus. So you can almost do the measurement right when you get there. And in a case like that, this is what it could be. And then 6 weeks later, it's back to what it always was.
Organizational inertia is a
Yeah.
killer.
Yeah.
Louis?
Well, I have a fear, and I don't know if you put any thought to this, but as we've moved from the analog into the digital world, the notion of counting things to come up with metrics is really disappearing. We're trying to contribute meaningfully to the AI effort. I don't think we're going to be counting stuff, but I'm not sure how we would classify our metrics there. But I have the sense deep down that I think if we spend time looking for things to count, we're just stuck in an old paradigm.
That's a very interesting comment. It to me, my mind leaps immediately to how do you measure quality?
Yeah.
Because when I think about using AI in most present day circumstances, It's about feeding good stuff in to get good stuff out. So you're right. We're not counting like how much stuff you're putting in, but how good is it and how good is the result? And I'm not sure, honestly, how to measure that. It's not just throughput. Does that require and maybe it does, a quality assurance function at the exit from the AI engine for somebody to, electronically put inspected by number 16 this passed.
Okay, so there's one
I-
other
I-
take. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go.
There's one other take that you could have on this metrics thing, and that is our metrics are absolutely irrelevant. What matters is the metrics of the people in the operations. So if they can handle 16 cases now instead of 8, because we have set up an infrastructure that they can do that, those are the metrics that we should be able to rely on. And I always wonder when people ask me for ROI, I used to think, well, we just painted the office last year. What's the ROI on that?
Yeah.
To the degree that we're
Yeah.
overhead. So
Well, John, on both your previous comments, I think that raises kind of an interesting point about, and Steve's as well, kind of about quantitative versus qualitative metrics, right?
yeah.
How do you measure employee satisfaction? Well, you can't really directly. You can do surveys, and some people will give, I used to do this in training. Some people would give me a 10 out of 10 as long as I didn't set the place on fire. And other people would never have given me a 10 out of 10, even if I had given them a gold bar as a parting gift, right? It's just the way people are. And so as a trainer, I don't really pay a whole lot of attention to those quantitative scale of 1 to 5 things. I pay attention to the comments. Jesse talked way too much about chocolate and hot sauce and crazy jello recipes and not enough time on taxonomies, which is why I use those 3 examples. That's something I can benefit from and learn from, but it's really, really hard to put a number to, right? And so I think part of the thing, going back to the story we're trying to tell, is what is it that moves that story forward? And if the metric doesn't support that directly or as a contributing factor, why are we measuring it? So I'm using this as kind of a transition to the panel and the extended panel. Do you have any horror stories about metrics, things that you were measuring and that you maybe shouldn't have, or where it went horribly, horribly wrong? As opposed to what Chris said, it doesn't improve the story. It actually made the story worse or harder to understand. And I'll open it up to everybody.
So Jesse, this is Cindy. The horror story we had with evidence collection was when I first started running the reports for leadership, I started reporting the number of cases the firm had that month,
Okay.
which is really, I should have known better, really super close to the vest. You don't really want to advertise your
Right.
current or potential litigation, a good learning moment for me. And so what we ended up doing was tweaking it to say, changing again from numbers to percentages, of the number of litigations requests made, what percentage yield email, electronic records, Teams chat, etc., to kind of show that. And then for a very small percentage of C-suiters, they got the numbers because, again, they referenced to my comment earlier, they were the ones interested in trends from a resource perspective and a cost perspective.
Right.
What kind of headcount did we need in a society where there's workforce reductions going on? What did we need to maintain and how much would it cost? So yeah, the mistake was just blurting out. I mean, I thought it was kind of cool. Look how valuable we are. Look how much stuff we did. And it turns out you really don't want to brag about some of those numbers. Better to just put a percentage.
Sure. And the other thing with that one in particular is that's not something you have a whole lot of control over, right? You might get sued twice in 1 month and 200 times the following month. Deborah, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead, please.
So it wasn't my personal experience as the presenter, but I was in the room as this was being presented, and it was not even believable. the numbers that they put together, it was not credible. I and I think they lost the whole room when they started throwing out numbers with M behind it or K behind it. Uh, that was just there was just no way it was believable, and everybody in the room knew it. So I think make sure that it's credible and believable is very important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll kind of add a little story. So, service level agreements. If you're in an organization, I'll use a third party vendor. You're inside a corp. You're a third party vendor and you have certain service level agreements that you have to meet, right? The sometimes you're measuring, I'll use mailroom or digitization scanning efforts. You're literally doing the number of pages, right? What does that do? Okay, great. Is that measuring back to your service level agreements? Maybe. Are you meeting your service level agreements? Your metrics, and I've heard this in some groups that have those third parties that they're struggling to meet their service level agreements because they don't have people, right, to do the work. Great metric to have. If you're not meeting your service level agreements, you're doing all of this work, but you know you can't increase the work because you don't have the bodies to do it. That's a story. That's a story to tell senior leaders that, hey, we've got to have more bodies to be able to do this. Or next contract cycle, we need to adjust our SLAs.
I want to tie on to that one a little bit. As a consultant, I've been involved in my share of time and motion studies, and we're all about trying to do more with less. And so for years, we as consultants and the vendor community as well have bandied about numbers that say, the average employee spends 2 hours a day searching, and that equates to 25% of their time. And across John's company of 30,000 employees, that's 80 million hours a year. And if you could just reduce that by 10%, you'd save $20 quadrillion. The maths. The math works, right? The problem is that you're assuming that those 20 quadrillion hours are all going to be saved and turned back into work rather than smoke breaks, taking off a little early on Friday, watching the Final Four streaming, etc. And it never works out that way. People are like, oh, that means I can reduce 27,000 of my head count and still be as productive as I am now. It really doesn't. And yet we still see those. And I hope I'm not guilty of doing this anymore, but we still see these proposals from especially our vendor community that will do that math and expect it to be believed. And to Deborah's point, nobody believes it. I don't know why we even run those numbers anymore. They're definitely not telling the story we think they are because of the lack of believability.
Well, it's lazy, I think. It's the old joke about the guy on the street corner selling $10,000 pencils. Well, you just have to sell one and I'm good.
Yeah.
It's like it's not realistic. It's a cop out in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It's something of a macro statement bred out of this, but it is one of the reasons when I'm working with clients to help them develop RFPs, I tell them frame this in a way where the responding vendors can't get away with an answer like that because it doesn't mean anything. Like you said, Jesse, the maths, but so what? That sort of isn't the point. And so again, it all comes back to, well, what are we trying to do and how do you measure that? How do you know even that's a problem? Well, it feels bad. Okay. I don't feel well. Take your temperature. And
Yeah.
then take it again later.
A trend.
A trend. Well, it's another old joke, right? Partial score 7. Okay. partial trend, one data point.
Right.
So I do think, and I'll pin the responsibility in both ways, but in both directions, but primarily on a lot of the customers. I think broadly, there are a lot that abdicate their responsibility to think this through, figuring, well, the vendors know they've done a lot of this, so whatever they tell me is probably pretty good. And I'm not even meaning to suggest in most cases that it's intentional on the vendor's part, because a lot of it's just how they've grown up as companies in a lot of cases. And especially with a fresh customer, some of these metrics sound outlandish, but they're actually accurate. I did an ROI analysis for somebody and did it straight, by the book. And we looked at the result and said, there's no way anybody's going to believe this. The improvements were that dramatic because they had come from an archaic position. So basically doing
Yeah.
anything was going to look. So we actually, in that case, we had to sandbag a little bit, which was really kind of weird. So it's not like a horror story, Jesse, like you were seeking before, but it was a really interesting conversation with the powers that be. And we finally said, the math actually worked out better, but even if it doesn't, it's still pretty good.
Yeah. And Deborah just posted into the chat, that kind of leads into who is your audience, right? Not only what is the story you're trying to tell, but that story probably depends on who you're pitching it to.
Mhm.
Are you talking to the ops folks or are you talking to senior management? And that goes to Cindy's story as well. In the time we have left, one of the things that we were hoping to get out of this was a comprehensive list of every single metric ever possible to be measured in the history of measuring. Or maybe not. But what we would like to talk about at least a little bit is are there some metrics that, and obviously it depends to Steve's point, but are there some metrics that you always try and make sure that you can capture and share with somebody who it matters to ensure that they understand the story that you're trying to tell? And I'll start with one. One of the things that we captured in kind of preparing for this is volumes. Lewis, don't listen to this part because this is numbers and volumes. But the idea that at least there is a story that we can tell by saying we went from X amount of digital storage to Y, or we cleaned up X percentage of our rot, or we ran how many miles and who's been running and who's still motivated and who's kind of slacking. So, what are the metrics that, if you could, you would always try and capture in your organizations? Don't everybody talk at once.
We did that already at the beginning.
We did.
Well, I'll start with a common one that I've seen. And it is back to the notion of time saved. I find it almost impossible to do any kind of meaningful governance work without actually talking about the process stuff. It can be squishy, especially if you try to do it like really broad strokes across, because processes are different one from another. Oh, we have Canadians on the line, so let's call them processes. But I do think it's important, even allowing for the fact that the time that can be retrieved isn't all going to get plowed right back into productive work. So a lot of the ROI work that I've done does try to take a meaningful stab at what is that time worth. So even if you only put half that time back in, what does that calculate out to? And even little bits saved in each step of a process can end up being significant. As you track the information as it moves across an organization, if you can save a little time here, a little time here, a little time here, suddenly, so like in a government context, the requirement to respond to a Freedom of Information Act style inquiry they tend to be time-based. You've got to respond within a week or 24 hours or 16 years, whatever it happens to be. Those little pieces adding up become extraordinarily relevant.
John posted, what percentage of data in my company is tied to some sort of retention? Data should be flowing like a river, not stored up like a dam. I need to chew on that one a little bit. John, did you want to expand on that or let that float as it is?
Well, I want to be able to say, hey, we had 30% of how many SharePoint sites we have are now have retention tied to it, or these 5 system applications now have retention tied to it. So the more I could show that, the more that records and information and data are going through some sort of disposition process.
Yeah, so that speaks, John, to data minimization efforts, which you could tie back to your IT folks and your cyber plus privacy from a data minimization effort. Like if we're doing this life cycle thing, then we are minimizing our data. We're minimizing potentially, risks for breaches. If you start doing this retention life cycle thing, you may see a reduction in those breaches.
My boss is actually the data privacy officer for the company, so that fits in well.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Lewis.
Louis.
I had I can share a story at one of the departments I was at. The Freedom of Information group did a calculation by taking the whole group's budget and dividing it by the number of documents they released to come up with a figure of $7 per document to review. Now, obviously that's a very rough figure, but if you were to show that we have 100 employees this year, next year, and the year after, but our metrics show we have 10,000 assets this year, but 50,000 next year and 100,000, you can actually draw a baseline on the amount that each person has to manage. So that is one way we could take a measurement.
Even if it's a relatively thin measurement, if you will, it's possibly still better than no measurement. And I've done that very kind of math with like privacy violations. XYZ Corp was, 600,000 customer, and the fine total to, so on a per breach basis, it was this, and I haven't done that recently, but the conclusion was it's really just the cost of doing business. It's worth it to the company to pay the fine because on a per each, it was like $6 or something ridiculously small. So I think it can be an effective way to do it, especially in the absence of anything else.
Well, and maybe the flip side to that is if 10,000, 100 people can do 10,000 of the widgets, and you're predicting that you're going to have 100,000 of the documents to review in 2 years, does it stand to reason that you can ramp up from 100 people to 1,000 people to do that same work in 2 years? I think it makes a case that you have to ramp up some, but I think then you also invite a discussion on the one hand, why are we getting so many of these? 2, is there a way to make it more readily available through, say, a public portal or some other way? Because at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to hire 10 times your staff to deal with the 10 times increase, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that use of metrics, I think, definitely tells a story that people need to hear, but then you've got to work through and so therefore what? Right? And that should always be kind of the end goal for metrics, I think, is and so therefore what? We're spending 11.2 quadrillion hours a week surfing the internet, and so therefore what? Are you going to turn it off? No. Are you going to put up filtering software? They don't work, so why would you spend the money? Maybe it's training. Maybe it's enforcement. Maybe it's taking somebody out back behind the building and horsewhipping them once a week just pour encourager les autres. I don't know. Go ahead, John.
We are doing redirects here, though. So anytime you search for any sort of AI website, it just redirects you back to our internal Gen AI site. So
I don't know if I like that.
You can't look at anything, just boop, right back. So
Chris just posted into the chat, minor horror story. We were piloting the use of an early AI tool to compare and mark up NDAs. Half the attorneys did not want to keep track of their time in order to collect those metrics. And I think that's an actually fascinating metric because, and Lewis, feel free to weigh in here since you're sort of uniquely qualified as a recovering attorney. Um, Law firms have been about the billable hour since time immemorial, right? And we're experimenting with different practices, but I know, at least in my head, in the clients I work with, if you're doing legal review of a document, I expect that if you're using an AI tool, first of all, you disclose it. And second of all, you're not billing me $400 an hour times 30 hours to review that contract because it didn't take you that long. And so I think we're just on the cusp of a radical change in how we do and bill that type of work. And it's going to hit consultants too, I think, but especially in law firms doing kind of standard, repetitive, first year, second year associate work. And they're using AI to kind of, I don't want to say cut corners, but reduce the amount of work involved. Go ahead, Lewis.
No, so you're right. I think this challenged the way law firms have traditionally worked, and the ones that are aware of that are looking at alternatives to setting up billing structures, whether it's some combination of value billing, where you say this is thing, a lease is worth whatever.
Right.
But we absolutely cannot continue to be charging for tasks that the machine can do instantly and think somehow we have the right to keep doing it. And
Yeah.
I think it does apply to consultants too going forward, because we used to maybe spend 20 hours writing a report. I'm able to
Yeah.
write that faster now.
Yeah. I'm seeing an awful lot of that in the e-discovery circles that I follow and in the consulting circles that I follow, that we're pretty much in some ways being forced into a value-based billing model, because between the reduction of cost for simple legal and consulting tasks and the reduction of effort expected by the customers who are paying for it, as you say, a 20-hour report is now maybe a 4-hour report. And your pricing doesn't necessarily have to reflect that, but there's increasing pressure on it to do it. John just posted, AI can reduce the route for e-discovery. Yes, but I think AI can do an awful lot of things, but, right? And we just had another one the other day where there was a reading list posted by somebody. I don't think it was the New York Times, but it was somebody of that caliber. They posted a reading list, summer reading list, things you should take to the beach and read this year. The books didn't exist. The authors in some cases did, but no author had written any of the books that were listed in that reading list. That's a pretty good metric. How many of your stories have to be called back because AI inappropriately padded them, let's say?
Well, I'll add another piece or another caveat, which in various fora people have heard me say, but a lot of the things that we say AI can do that, you may not need AI to do, considering the cost, even though that's coming down, but the amount of computing power, it's not the most green technology out there. So it's a different discussion, but it's interesting that our discussion of metrics has led us here. It led us to pricing models. It led us to the efficacy of AI, and I think that's an important finding of this little confab here. And I think it's appropriate because I guess unwittingly, I'm looking at the clock. I guess it's my closing argument, counselor. But metrics, to be valuable and to avoid the mayhem, that was one of the other M's in our title. It is all about the context. And I like to work it both ways, not only, operationally up, but strategically down, and try to get them to meet in the middle. It's like the channel, right? They start building it, digging at each end, and what happens if they don't meet? You get two channels. But But I think that's an important takeaway from this, that it's more than just, as you say, Louis, counting things. Sometimes you have to count the things, but like, why? And what kind of analysis are we going to put on top of that so that we can make some sort of a meaningful change?
Yeah, I wonder if one of our future topics might be storytelling, because this aligns very well to that in terms of it doesn't matter what you're measuring if it's not telling a story that is of value to somebody else. Donda, I'm going to let you offer the closing thoughts for the entire session.
Gulp.
Gee, thanks. No, I would, my message to my clients is the meaningfulness. You have to have the context to what it is and be able to measure those things that are important to your senior leaders, but also you need the insights from an operational perspective. So make them meaningful for you so that you can tell your story to senior leaders. It is about the story. Yeah, everybody wants numbers and percentages and whatnot, but it's the context behind those things that is going to get your message across to your senior leaders, to get the funding that you might need, or to make the changes that you are trying to embrace and adopt.
Well, and to prove that you made those changes, right? Because
Absolutely.
you set a baseline. Well, did we achieve it? Actually, Chris gets the final thought. For project leaders, especially consultants, the metrics need to show expected value up front and proof of delivery at project end and beyond. And I think that's a great way to kind of encapsulate the metrics discussion. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. As Steve, our lovely and talented host, said, he's going to do some light and not so light editing in bits and pieces, and then you'll see this as snippets. You'll see this as the entire YouTube thing on the channel. And we hope you'll join us again in June when we'll be talking about something, and we'll let you know what that is just as soon as we figure out what it is.
Thank you all
Well
for
done.
joining the
Thanks,
group.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you
Have
soon.
a great rest of your week.